Well, good morning and welcome to a Chili Potchefstroom. Good morning and welcome to Rasha Christi, South Africa. We are a student campus ministry based here in South Africa with chapters at a number of the major universities in South Africa. And welcome to our interview of the week. This week we have a special guest with us this morning. Typically these events are done in the evenings, but we're going to tackle this one this morning. And yes, welcome to all of those who are going to join us live this morning or might listen to this video further down the line. We are a student campus organization that is a Christian organization that seeks to try and help Christians better understand the reasons for the Christian faith, to look at the various arguments for the Christian faith, whether those are philosophical, historical, scientific, and to better prepare Christians to engage in discourse with others who don't share the Christian faith, and to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with them. That is our goal and that is our mission. And we are privileged this morning to be able to tackle a very important subject that has to do with economics. And of course, whether you're a Christian or not, economics applies to you and everybody's involved in economics. And of course, we want to ask ourselves this morning, well, what do we know about economics and how does economics work? And these are very important questions, particularly in the age we're living with all the kinds of chaos across the globe and people's lives being impacted by things like the COVID virus, for example, and losing their income. And so this morning we have an expert in this area visiting us from Johannesburg. Chris Hattingh is with the Free Market Foundation. The Free Market Foundation is an economic think tank organization based in Johannesburg. They've existed for a number of decades and have a rich history of standing up for freedom and a view of economics, which we will discover, called the free market economics system. And they've existed during and combated the apartheid regime for many decades, standing up for people's freedom and also their right to trade and do economics in a particular way, a free way. And they've continued to exist through the changes from apartheid to the current new South Africa, if I could use that term, and continue to stand up wherever they see freedom being violated or bad economic ideas and policies being implemented. And so since this issue applies to both Christians and non-Christians, we wanted to get somebody whose daily job is to deal with these matters to come and talk to us this morning about the free market and what that is and what that's all about. Chris is the Deputy Director of the Free Market Foundation, and I would encourage all of you who want to find out more, do visit the Free Market Foundation website. They've got loads of resources and materials, and also a very rich library of recordings on the YouTube channel on all kinds of topics related to economics globally, and then also economics locally here in South Africa, and even more broadly in Africa as well. So they really are a library of information on these issues. And so good morning to you, Chris.
Good morning, Simon. Great pleasure to be with you. As always, I'm always very lucky when I get to talk to you and the people in your organization. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I hope we can warm each other up with our ideas, that we can have a good exchange, a good discussion. Always a pleasure to exchange sort of thoughts on how these things work and how they apply to our lives.
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. And thank you for giving us your time this morning to do this interview for us. We just want to start off with then, I don't have an economics background, but then again, not many people have formal training in economics and economic theory, but yet we're all participating in this thing called economics in some way, shape or form. Nobody escapes it. And of course, as I begin to study this matter, because I get a lot of questions, I've been introduced to various views of economic systems. And I came across your organization, and over the years I've gotten to know you. But this morning our topic is an introduction to the free market, what it is, how it works, and why does it matter. And that's, I think, the title of the talk. And you're going to be giving us a PowerPoint presentation, which you put together for us. And so if you can, when we hand over to you, if you can dive into that. And then once you finish your presentation, we'll pepper you with a few questions. We might even have some folks online who join us, and so we'll pick up some questions from our online team if there's anybody listening this morning, and then we'll throw those at you as well, and that'll be the shape of this conversation. So if I can hand over to you now, and you can share screen and dive into your PowerPoint, that would be great.
Perfect. Let's get right into it. I do apologize if there's a bit of a hum in the background. That's from our generators at the office. So that's of course thanks to load shedding in South Africa. And again, I mean, that's sort of a lucky coincidence, but how load shedding in a way points again to economics and the role of the state and the role of, what the state should be doing or shouldn't be doing. And then when the state fails, the private sector tries to fill the void. So that's when you have the sound of generators filling, as it were, the air around South Africa. Okay, we've got my presentation here. I just want to make sure that you can see my slides.
Yeah, if you can put it in presenter view, because at the moment there we go. Perfect. Excellent.
Okay, cool. So just to start off with that image that I've chosen there, it might not be something that people normally associate with the free market. The free market might be associated with big corporates and massive bottom lines and the profit making of sort of faceless capital behind the scenes on the JSE stock exchange, maybe on the S&P 500 on Wall Street. From our perspective, the free market is as basic. In a way, it's miraculous, but it's as basic as a corner side shop. It's as basic as your grocery store. It's simply people voluntarily engaging with each other, exchanging goods and services that they think is best for themselves and for their families. They want to increase their quality of life. So they engage with each other voluntarily. And this ranges from the lady on the street corner trying to sell vegetables to the biggest corporate in the world that one can find. A bit of a meta point here. Of course, my background is philosophy. I have an MPhil in business ethics from Stellenbosch, so I always like talking about philosophy and ideas whenever I can. I can tend to go off the N1, off into different side roads and small towns in South Africa. But if you'll run with the analogy, I think that ideas and ideologies very much inform the policies that governments implement, and these policies have either good or negative consequences. And this boils down to your personal life as well. The ideology or the philosophy or the worldview that you hold informs your values, what you consider important, what you consider to be your role in the world, how you should interact with people or not, if you should do so voluntarily or through force. And I think this all boils down to ideology. So the worldview that you hold will inform what you think of relationships, communities, the role that the state should play, and this informs policies, and policies have concomitant effects. A quote from Ayn Rand. She's a big figure in Austrian economics, in the philosophy of economic freedom, as it were. In her book For the New Intellectual, she says, just as a man's actions are preceded and determined by some form of idea in his mind, so a society's existential conditions are preceded and determined by the ascendancy of a certain philosophy among those whose job is to deal with ideas. The events of any given period of history are the result of the thinking of the preceding period. And this points to academia, for example, universities, where a lot of your audience, Simon, of course, are students finding their way through university. And the intellectuals can largely determine the course of a society. So if you're interested in the direction in which South Africa is going, try and find out what the major ideas and philosophies are at academia across the country. That can point you to what sort of society they envision the world and the country to be. And if the policymakers adopt those ideas, they'll also go in that direction. Just a bit on the free market and what it is, a few sort of explainers, as it were. A fundamental notion of the free market is the notion that individuals are free to think, and then to act. So to freely, from interference, from force, or from fraud, to think in the world, to evaluate their own abilities and characteristics, their strengths and weaknesses, what resources they have, and to then act in the world to try and pursue their values of whatever form that might take. The importance of innovation and creation. The free market is very much about pushing forward, as it were, and not necessarily only in the case of new technological advances, but social advances, how we view each other, how we deal with each other, how we use the resources in the world around us to improve our lives. Very importantly, to fail and to suffer the consequences thereof, to learn and to build again. So nothing is is perfect and we're all fallible. We all make mistakes, but the importance there is with the freedom side of it. You have the freedom from force, but you also have the responsibility to take hold of your life and to deal with the consequences of your decisions. The enemy of reason and individualism is coercion. So, for the free market, when you have onerous government interference and legislation that prohibits business activity and individual life and individual interaction, you have the breakdown of the free market. Another idea from Ayn Rand was the sort of concept that A is A. So reality is what it is. We need to use our reason to figure out what it is. And wishing differently doesn't make it so. So we can wish that resources in the world were unlimited, that wealth was simply a pie that could be divided up equally amongst everyone. But unfortunately, wishing that things are in a certain way doesn't make them so. And that's part of the free market worldview, is realizing that people have limited abilities, and the best way for them to use their different abilities is to interact with each other and amplify each other's strengths. Continuing a little bit on what is the free market, just at the top here, a quote from Milton Friedman: the essential notion of a capitalist society is voluntary cooperation and voluntary exchange. The essential notion of a socialist society is force. For the free market, the primacy.
Chris.
Unshare and share again. Let's stop share and let's go back. Share screen. Share this one. Working now. Okay, we're continuing on what is the free market and sort of the concepts thereof, what underpins it. A very important part of this is the primacy of the individual agency and dignity. And from this flows community interaction and communities' voluntary associations. But underpinning all of that is that the individual is unique, the individual has dignity, the individual has worth. And from there, you have the flowing of interactions and relationships between people. We consider the free market or capitalism, these sort of terms are interchangeable, the only moral economic framework because it places individual happiness and values at the center. The conception of individual rights, for a lot of students who are involved in politics and sociology, maybe some anthropology, they will be familiar with different views of rights and conceptions thereof. So for us, individual rights are paramount. They constrain government action and intervention. We don't advocate for an anarchist society, so we believe there should be some form of government, but this should be as limited as possible to the protection of individual rights. People in society should not use force or fraud against each other. Thus, from there follows individual rights and freedom of action. When a business, for example, engages in fraudulent behavior, we believe there is a case for the state to intervene and become involved. The role of government, again, is to protect rights. Capitalism and free markets do not pretend or portend to be utopian or utopianist. Resources are finite and people are going to make mistakes, and they're going to, with the freedom that comes with capitalism, they're going to make mistakes in their daily lives, but they should have that freedom. I think it's very important to keep in mind, as another point, that any ideology that offers you perfection or a utopia should be treated with great suspicion. Usually the road to utopia, quote unquote, is paved with the bones of individuals, of people in society. The importance of property rights and free speech. This is vital for the functioning of the free market. So in a nutshell, what separates humans from other animals, in our view, that is our reason. Not that all of us always use it very well or to the same extent, but we have this ability to use reason to live, and we should use that freely on our property. To survive, you need to think and then act, and your acting in whatever way you judge best should be free from interference from others. So this is why you should be free on your own property to make your own decisions. The right to own and keep property of various forms. So property isn't just a house, for example. It could be a factory. It could be a book you've written. It could be this presentation that I'm doing. Then you have other forms of property, like intellectual property, of course. But all of this should be protected by the state and not interfered with. We have in South Africa, unfortunately, at the moment, a push towards amending Section 25 of the Constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation. And this will fundamentally dilute the property rights of all South Africans and negatively affect our economic freedom and quality of life. The importance of the sanctity of your person, your property, and your speech. So again, the freedom to think, as it were, on your property and to be free from interference from that. We are seeing different forms of interference with that now, maybe on campuses. Some governments are also heading in this direction where they want to, quote unquote, police your thought. And that's very dangerous for a free society, because ultimately bureaucrats and politicians are going to try and protect their own interests and prevent people from even thinking or saying certain things. Continuing on a bit on this idea of property rights and free speech, it's always important to ask oneself the question, what was the status quo before capitalism, industrialization, democracy, and the rule of law? In general, the status quo was poverty. It was grinding hunger, poverty, suffering, wealth exchanged hands through force. So the bigger your group or your tribe, the better off you would be. If they had the necessary military might, they could take wealth from others. Your fate was largely determined by the circumstances into which you were born. And then with the advent of capitalism, we have the idea of wealth creation. So you can invest for the long term, you can create wealth for yourself and for your family. That's why it's different from what came before. How does the free market work? Voluntary exchange to mutual benefit. So you freely engaging with someone else, giving your time, your ability, your resources, your products, your goods, or your services, and trying to convince them to engage with you as well to your own benefit. The importance of free will, that you're a free agent, as it were, that you have this ability to judge. It's the capitalism and free markets are very much more free will based instead of determinist, as some other ideologies and political philosophies are. The importance of capital creation, accumulation, and investment. And again, capital investment is different things. It's a mine shaft, it's a factory, it's a bookstore. It might be physical property, it might be an online platform in whatever business you're trying to build, but it's different forms of this idea. The freedom to work as you want on the terms that you want. This is when we run into issues around things like the minimum wage, for example, that bureaucrats think they can determine for people for what wage they should be able to work, but we believe that individuals should be free to choose what they want to work for and in what circumstances they want to work. The importance of value subjectivity, as it were, voting for businesses, products, or services with your rands or your dollars. If you're upset and displeased with a certain business, then you have the freedom to go elsewhere. And what you consider to be important on the day to day, the product that you want to buy, that value is subjective to you. You might have very good reasons for it, but ultimately, it's not for a bureaucrat to decide what reasons you should have for buying something. And you have this idea versus the labor theory of value, which is a Marxist idea that if you sink 100 hours of work into something, someone should pay you for it. Well, ultimately, you need to convince people that you should be paid for it, and you should find people who voluntarily want to engage in that. I can spend many hours painting the most perfect painting that the world has ever seen, but if someone doesn't value it and doesn't want to exchange money in exchange for that, or other forms of exchange. It might be another form of currency. It might be Bitcoin, which would be great because I wish I had more Bitcoin now. But if you need to appreciate that just because you sink hours into something doesn't mean it will have worth in the marketplace. You need to find out and assess what is of value to the market and identify what is important to different people in the market. What are the wants and needs of people around you? How to measure economic freedom or capitalism. So here we have two indices. On the one hand, we have the Economic Freedom of the World Index from the Fraser Institute in Canada. And on the other hand, we have the Index of Economic Freedom from the Heritage Foundation in the US. The Fraser Institute measures the degree to which the policies of institutions are supportive of economic freedom, and they measure this freedom across five areas. We have number one, size of government; number two, legal system and property rights; number three, sound money; number four, freedom to trade internationally; and number five, regulation. And then the Heritage Index measures across four areas: the rule of law, government size, regulatory efficiency, and open markets. We'll get to this a little bit later, but just a sort of teaser, South Africa has been steadily sliding down both of these indices for the last about 20 odd years. Why is economic freedom important? I mean, it's great talking about these theories, but as I mentioned at the beginning, ideologies and philosophies have an impact on the world and on your life. So, why is the free market so important for you, for your life, for your family, for your community? So, poverty is the natural state. What ingredients or policies are needed to increase wealth and prosperity? In general, where capitalism wins, poverty loses. It's very important for human flourishing, as those indices that I mentioned in the previous slide indicate. Where economic freedom is higher, on average, people have better quality of life. They're better able to pursue their values. They're better able to create wealth for themselves, and they're not just dependent on the state. To the extent that free markets are tried, people are better off. The opposite is true for socialist and communist systems. And again, neither 100% free markets nor 100% socialist societies have been implemented. But the more one trends in that direction, the more you're going to have either positive or negative effects on people's lives. And just this graph here on the side, I hope you can see it well. So this is from the Economic Freedom of the World Index, economic freedom and the standard of living. So on the bottom axis, you have the score of the country. As this increases, you see that countries are generally higher up in terms of their GDP per capita here on the left. So when their scores are low here on the left-hand side, then the GDP per capita tends to be quite low. And at the bottom of underneath the graph, you can see the average GDP per capita by economic freedom category. So the mostly free countries have, on average, $71,000 GDP per capita in terms of people's sort of economic activity and quality of life. And I think that sort of points to exactly the real effects of having these policies implemented in the world. A little bit more on why the free market is important. We have quality of life here. More people are generally more productive. They live better and longer lives, and there are better literacy levels. People living in countries with higher levels of economic freedom on average enjoy greater prosperity, more political and civil liberties, and live longer lives. Indeed, countries in the top quartile had an average per capita GDP of 670,000 Rand in 2018, compared to 87,000 Rand for the countries in the bottom quartile. Again, the idea of creationism versus redistributionism. There's a focus on growth and innovation, baking your own pie or cake, whichever analogy you would prefer, making your own cook sisters and not just having the state to give you cook sisters that they've taken from someone else. The idea of long-term investment and capital accumulation. This is a great graph again showing just the quality of life around the world and how it has been increasing. Of course, it's very easy of us to get pessimistic about the state of the world for various different reasons, and we should talk about those reasons. We shouldn't ignore these things, but we should also keep in mind that things have been improving in general, where economic freedom has been increasing. And in general, the trend around the world has been an increase. There's pockets here and there where, unfortunately, it's going in the wrong direction. Places like Venezuela, Zimbabwe, I would argue South Africa, North Korea, of course, Argentina, maybe some parts of Europe are going in that direction. But as you can see from these different areas, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, some parts of the Middle East and Africa, just the share of people living in extreme poverty is declining. And that's because more wealth and investment is being created, and people are not just having to rely on the state. Again, in the South African context, this doesn't mean that the state can't, for example, do something like provide some measure of welfare, but it needs to be limited. It shouldn't be the complete end all and be all, and we shouldn't pretend that this is the only thing that will solve poverty and hunger and that kind of thing. In general, you need economic freedom to solve these problems. You're not going to have social welfare first without actual economic freedom and wealth creation. That's why the Scandinavian countries at the moment do quite well. Decades ago, they reformed their economies, they had more economic freedom, they allowed more elements of the free market to exist, and that's why they can now have stronger social welfare systems. A little bit on South Africa, the current state of play, and how the free market factors into our context here, how it plays into our lives, why it's so important for us. So at the moment, South Africa has 42% unemployment. Over 11 million people are unemployed, and that's on the expanded definition. That's people who have tried to stop looking for work as well. In the last week, so the slide I made a few weeks ago, but in the last week, Stats SA released their latest numbers, and I believe the number is now 11.4 million people unemployed. But I would encourage all of you to go and look into those stats. Also, in terms of the youth number, it is around 74% of the youth who could be working are unemployed, and that's a devastating statistic and a devastating number for South Africa currently and for our future. We need to think of policies and ideas that are going to allow the youth to take charge of their own lives and to actually have the freedom to pursue jobs and to pursue the values that they want. We can't keep on going in this direction where 74% of the youth are unemployed. Before COVID-19, South Africa had an average economic growth of around 2 to 3%. That's simply not enough for an emerging market economy. We have an ever increasing debt to GDP ratio. We will probably hit 100% within the next few years. And this again is passed onto the shoulders of the youth because the youth have to pay off this debt in the future. Our credit rating at the moment, we are in junk status, which means that making debt repayments is more difficult, and this again places a higher burden on future generations. Things like South African Airways, Eskom, Denel, Transnet, the Post Office, bailing out these state-owned entities has led the credit rating agencies to downgrade South Africa, and that's why our debt rating is currently so low. Unfortunately, South Africa has bought into the idea that we can redistribute people into prosperity, but you can only do so much redistribution before all the wealthy people start to leave the country, and you need to actually think about creating wealth instead of just redistributing it. And you also can't really, redistribution won't be effective if you don't have an actual functioning economy that's active, that's trying to create new businesses where there's dynamism. Redistribution isn't going to just magically unlock that sort of economic activity that we need. In which direction will we go? Well, this is largely up, of course, to the voters, to the people of South Africa. Over the last few election cycles, the share of people who don't vote has grown. So you wonder if they had been voting, might there be a different ruling party in South Africa? But, ultimately it's up to the people of the country to choose their political party and where they want the country to go. Continuing on state of South Africa, so those indices we talked about earlier, on the Heritage Foundation Index, South Africa ranked 99th in 2021, so that's part of the mostly unfree group. On the Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom of the World Index, in the year 2000, South Africa ranked 58th. However, in this year's edition, we were ranked 90th out of 162 countries. So you can see the slide there that has continued. After 1994, South Africa really did engage in the right kind of reforms. President Mandela and the ANC implemented the kind of policies that the country needed. We changed from a very largely state-controlled system under apartheid to more economic freedom, and people's quality of life increased. The share of the middle class, which was black people, increased a lot. Unfortunately, now we're heading in the opposite direction where we have less economic freedom. A last point, South Africa needs radical structural reform, not things like expropriation without compensation, the national health insurance, prescribed assets, nationalizing the Reserve Bank, just printing money. These things simply increase the control and the power of the state over people's lives. And we shouldn't go in this direction if we truly value quality of life and eliminating poverty in South Africa. Looking forward a bit and just some ideas for people to sort of go with and think about and chew over, as it were. So I quite like this idea that your cell phone gives you more services than the state gave your parents. So again, no matter what the government's tried to do, we think that the free market is nonetheless still very dynamic, and people innovate and they try and find solutions. Again, with the load shedding example, people buy generators, they install solar panels, they go off the grid. They try and find solutions where the state fails, and maybe the more the state tries, the more sort of people are going to slip through its fingers, as it were. We think decentralization is going to increase more around the world, taking power back from big capitals and municipalities, as it were. So the power doesn't necessarily just rest in Pretoria and Bloemfontein and Cape Town anymore, but it rests in small towns in the Karoo, in the Free State, and that kind of thing, where communities and community action groups try to solve their own problems instead of waiting for a bureaucrat to come down from wherever they might be. The importance of pursuing your values. So politics and these sorts of discussions, while very important, shouldn't necessarily be your end value. You can take a lot of power back into your own hands by pursuing your values, caring for yourself, for your community, making sure that you take care of people around you. These sorts of things are very important, and your life should be a lot richer than just politics. For example, you shouldn't ignore politics, because politics is very interested in you, and unfortunately, the bigger the government is, the more interested politics is in you. But there's a great way to take back power, and that's by pursuing your values and pursuing what's important to you and your life. The vital importance of human potential. We think this has been untapped for millennia. Governments in different forms have tried to inhibit human potential for their own ends, but people ultimately find a way. They try to do what they think is best, and this potential will always be there. We just need to have the right framework and the right ideas in place. And that's sort of the last slide there. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please do so. My email address, chrishattingh@fmfsa.org, and our website is www.freemarketfoundation.com. Also, our YouTube channel. You can find us on YouTube. Just search channel FMF for all of our podcasts, our presentations. Last week, we had a workshop on the national health insurance. For any of you interested in healthcare matters, you can watch those. Please get in touch with us with your ideas, your questions, your feedback, different things you think we should focus on. And then just and sort of last quote, I think, which is quite a good one to leave on, is that one at the top there: to take away a man's freedom of choice, even his freedom to make the wrong choice, is to manipulate him as though he were a puppet and not a person. That is, I think, the fundamental free market view of people and how they should be free to live and to act. Thank you.
Well, of course, thank you, Chris, for that presentation. Just as we move to your, all right, that's great. I really appreciate that introduction to the free market economics, and as I said, the way you opened your PowerPoint there by saying that it has to do not just with the typical notion of people in suits and ties in Sandton, that it has to do with the vendors on the streets, some guy working in his workshop making, furniture, anybody who's out there fixing shoes, a cobbler or whatever, they're all participating in the free market. So we've got a question here that's come through, and it's a good one, a very basic question, but I think it applies to every person in South Africa. What can the everyday citizen do to help South Africa toward a road of recovery?
Number one is probably calling for the recall of certain politicians, but that's a big campaign, as it were, and you need to see which political parties are interested in that, because I think we need to start really holding our politicians accountable and recalling those who have pushed us in this negative direction. Look, I think it's important to realize that you don't have to take all of this on your own shoulders. So none of us are Milton Friedman or Ayn Rand or, take your pick, Frederick Bastiat. We can work part of the community organizations in South Africa are very strong. So you can form part of something like AfriForum of Solidariteit, the Free Market Foundation, the Institute of Race Relations, Helen Suzman, Gift of the Givers, all these different charities and civil society organizations that do the good work in South Africa, want to care for each other. South Africans, I think, are fundamentally good. It's the best intentions of the government to pervert those good relationships between South Africans and sort of play up race tension and differences between race groups and political groups, as it were. So to me, it's as basic as forming part of these organizations that are important to you and using them to be your voice, participating in their activities to take back control and improving your community around you. I think the more people realize that communities can be robust, the less power they're going to give to the state. So we need to incentivize people to not just play into the political game of thinking, oh, every 4 years I'm going to vote for a party and they're going to give me X, Y, and Z. You need to take that power back. There's also we still live in a very strong participative democracy. You can, in your own way, you can write articles, you can write letters, you can do submissions to government. For example, we have the Firearms Control Amendment Bill, which is currently generating a lot of interest. You can make your comments on that. You can support different organizations in that sphere. So find different issues that are important to you. You don't have to comment on everything. There's way too much to do. We at the FMF try and cover as much as we can, but even we can't get to everything. So take back some control where you can, support organizations like ours, and slowly but surely we'll push South Africa in that right direction. I think for many in government, that they have a vision of the country, but it bumps into what people actually want. Even in Johannesburg now, I mean, where there's potholes on pretty much every road, people are trying to fix it. And I hope at some point that people are going to start making the calls as well for why should we pay our taxes for X, Y, or Z? Why should we do this? Why should we do that? It's on government to prove to us why we need to do X, why we need to give them a cut of our income, and are they actually using it for a good reason? So hold them to a higher standard.
Yeah, it's a strange thing to me that it's an odd affair, because of course politicians are just other South African citizens, but it's a bizarre arrangement that when we do elect officials, that somehow something happens in that midst there, or suddenly that they begin to just, I don't know why that ends up happening, but there's this trend towards just controlling everything. I mean, once they get appointed and once we elect them, then all of a sudden they turn around and they're telling everybody how to live our lives and what we should and shouldn't do. And you have to ask yourself, well, who are these people? You're just somebody next door, and it's a strange thing that, and I've always found this strange that, everybody has a problem with government, but then they all want to elect a government who then wants to turn around and tell them what to do. It's a bizarre state of affairs. And so maybe you can unpack that a bit for us, of this tension between, because you're not advancing an anarchist society where it's kind of every man for himself. You say there is a role for the government to play. So what would be some of the key issues there, if you could maybe unpack those for us? What role do you think the state does have to play in society?
Yeah, so ideally, from the sort of free market libertarian perspective, it would be stuff like administering the courts, and maybe police services, an army when there are serious national threats to national security. Ultimately, government needs to protect individual right, and it should have the tools to do that. But it should be very narrowly defined and clearly defined what are individual rights and what's the difference between negative rights and positive rights. Because for a lot of people now, the conception of rights is I have a right to a house, or I have a right to mobile data, or a car, or something. I mean, that imposes a burden on other people in society to provide that. So you're saying, in effect, the state should step in to provide those, and if people don't, then the state should use force to compel a doctor to give you health care, or a car manufacturer to give you a BMW kind of thing. I mean, maybe I'd be in favor of that if we all got C-class
Yes.
Mercedes, but not if we got BMWs. To go back a little bit of a step back and a meta point, the more we mix economics and politics, the more we're going to see an interventionist state, because different politicians, they portend to speak for people, quote unquote, and they might be
Yes.
the vanguard of the revolution, as it were. But ultimately, they're human beings, and they're going to make mistakes, and they're going to think, oh, we need to nationalize the mines or the banks or something to implement our vision of the world. So they're also, fallible. So you should limit their power as much as possible. You shouldn't have this mixing between the economics and the state, because then you incentivize things like corrupt behavior. You incentivize an interventionist state that wants to shape society in the way that it thinks it should go. That's why we've seen things like state capture, I believe. We shouldn't be shocked or surprised, as the president often is. He's often shocked at many of these revelations. But when you have a big government, you're going to have big corruption. To me, that follows necessarily. So the more we head in that direction, the more trouble we'll see from the state. And also, in some ways, the more strife we'll see between people, because the view becomes the only way I can get ahead is by voting for a party. And the only way I can get ahead, or someone else has gotten ahead, is because the state took something from someone else to give it to another person. We're heading too far away from the view that wealth can be created, that we need to create wealth through voluntary interaction. I mean, we often talk about things like inequality and why it's such a bad problem, but people never ask, how was the inequality, how did it come about? Did it come about because a business responded to a market need, or did it come about because the state prevented certain businesses from operating? Did the state protect big business from competition? Did they
Yeah.
entrench certain interests in the US? Did they maybe protect Silicon Valley at the cost of other businesses? You should always ask that question about, whenever these buzzwords and concepts are thrown around, sort of examine a bit, but what about this small element? What about this ingredient? Always ask, exactly how is this functioning? How is this working?
So would it be fair to say then that you think that the government's efforts should be directed not towards a campaign of redistribution, which is basically what most of the projects are, a redistribution, central control, lots of bureaucracy and red tape and laws under the guise of protecting people or the less fortunate. But they should focus actually on trying to create policies in which economic activity can thrive. It doesn't thrive under lots of red tape and bureaucracy. Is that what you think that the government should be doing? Is rather than focus on redistribution, focus on creating an environment in which the potential with which you spoke can be realized? Is that what? And if that's the case, give us two or three ideas that you think, if you were, say, for example, next year, Chris is in the government running the show now, what would be two or three policies that you would do to undermine what you think are counterproductive ideas in the current administration to kind of help this recovery model moving forward?
Well, I will say, if I'm in government next year, you probably won't hear me talking about free market ideals anymore. I'll become a full advocate of certain socialist policies. I mean, again, it's incentives. So if I get that paycheck, maybe I'll change the tune that I'm singing, as it were. But in all seriousness, a lot of it at the moment is stepping back, and that's counterintuitive to government, because they see a problem and they think we need more. We need more red tape. We need more bureaucracy. We need to have this regulation. We need to tell Netflix that they need to provide a 30% local content quota because South African producers and movie houses don't have a good platform, as it were. They always think more bureaucracy and more intervention. So, as some examples, I would, for example, implement a freeze on the national minimum wage. This would allow unemployed people to work on the terms that they want. It will also incentivize small businesses to hire people, more people, because at the moment the minimum wage acts as an artificial barrier to employment. It imposes more burdens on small and medium businesses. And big corporates can deal with this stuff, and they can hire one or two here or there, but we have a very stifling business economy. I would also very much advocate for a flat tax. I think there should be a flat tax rate across the board, and this again will hopefully incentivize South Africans to invest in the country. At the moment, we're heading in the direction where we have stuff like the wealth tax idea, where the more successful you are, the better you respond to market needs. The more wealth you create and the more wealth you earn, the more you're punished for that because you get taxed more. We should incentivize the opposite of that. We should incentivize people like Elon Musk to not leave the country, but to stay here, for example, to come back once they've been overseas, because then they'll create jobs here. That's what we want. We want people to be in employment. Another one I would love to implement and do quite quickly is freeing up the energy creation and distribution sector in South Africa. At the moment, Eskom and municipalities enjoy a monopoly in electricity. And this, again, it's interesting. Eskom is the only company, I think, in the world. I mean, please tell me if you can think of other examples, but the only company in the world that asks customers to use less of its product. And this, again, it enjoys a monopoly, and it's safe from when it doesn't provide good services. It gets bailouts when it doesn't do well. Same with South African Airways. You need to limit Eskom. I mean, it can still exist. It can provide some services to people who can't afford maybe going to the private sector or to private businesses. But you need to allow mining companies to go off the grid to provide electricity to themselves, to their communities, to the homes around them. You need to allow farmers to do this. You need to allow factories to generate their own electricity and not have to pay into the grid, not have to pay tariffs. That's very important because the moment you pay your taxes and your tariffs, but you don't get the product for that. So where is the incentive to still stay on the grid, as it were? Why government is incentivizing people to go off the grid? Maybe government is actually more free market than we thought. They're like incentivizing people to actually use free market solutions instead of relying on the state. So the electricity one is a big one to me, freeing up the energy market. South Africa is not going to grow without reliable electricity. Unfortunately, at the moment, we have lots of talks about job summits and government is going to have this infrastructure plan and this drive. None of that is going to happen without the electricity necessary to actually drive those products. You can have all the talk you want, but if you don't have reliable electricity, you're not going to see any of that stuff.
Okay. Let's just go back to this issue of the minimum wage, okay? Because typically when this gets thrown around, this is a big issue that a lot of politicians, see themselves as championing, the downtrodden. I'm going to make sure that anybody who's working doesn't get ripped off, So how do you attend to that basic intuition that people have about this issue when they say, there's the proverbial Scrooge, exploiting and enslaving people and making a fortune, and yet people having nothing. Maybe because I know the Free Market Foundation has a strong opinion on the minimum wage, but maybe you can unpack that for us. I've listened to some of Thomas Sowell's work, and I kind of agree with his assessment on some of these issues. And I encourage everybody here listening to this to also consult the work of Thomas Sowell. I think he's one of the finest economists alive today, and all of his work is just so enlightening. But perhaps you can talk about why would you get rid of something like the minimum wage? A lot of people see that as a way of protecting people from exploitation. How would you respond to that objection?
Yeah, so on the point of exploitation, you need to ask by what standard. So who gets to define exploitation? Is it a bureaucrat who sits in Pretoria or Cape Town, or is it the individual worker who gets to decide what they consider to be exploitation? Now, this isn't to say that companies or corporates can't try and get the most they want out of a worker, for example. But if we really want to accept and implement, I think, a robust conception of individual dignity and agency, you need to understand that people are going to make decisions with which you disagree, and they might work for wages or for other compensation with which you disagree. Maybe someone considers spending their time in a business more important than monetary compensation, and they want to have that time in exchange for it. So that as a first point, just who gets to define what exploitation is, and do we think we can think on behalf of other people what counts as exploitation? And often, it's panels and people in academia in the ivory towers who get to tell factory blue collar workers, no, you can't work for this amount. So it's better if you don't have a job than if you get paid X amount, which might be low by other standards. We need to also keep in mind, and I think you're exactly right to mention Thomas Sowell. He's unparalleled in thinking about these issues and trying to understand them, how they have an effect on people's lives, and how they sort of the butterfly effect, as it were, of certain policies. So when you increase the price of something, there's a good chance, when government increases the price of something artificially, there's a good chance that people are going to use less of that. So if you artificially increase the price of labor, small businesses and medium businesses are incentivized to employ fewer people. They might then invest in automation. They might invest in other systems. They might head in the direction where they have as few employees as possible. You need to figure out what your noble policies and intentions, however well you dress them up, are going to have a real effect in how businesses try to operate day to day and where they try to eliminate their costs. Finally, I'll say the minimum wage acts as a barrier to employment for unemployed people. It protects those who are currently in employment, very much so. It incentivizes businesses to keep those people that they have and not to take on more people, because who knows when the government might raise the minimum wage again. It's very arbitrarily defined. It's never clear when it's going to happen or by what standard, or sort of,
Yes.
why now and not a different time. So, I obviously encourage people to go read Thomas Sowell, as you've mentioned as well. I think he provides a lot of detail on this kind of stuff. just to give one quote from him, one thing he pointed out is that the group that is most harmed by minimum wage laws are those people who are low skilled, uneducated teenagers. They don't have the experience yet to be in the workforce, and they need to be given that time. But
Yeah,
a minimum wage. Sorry, go ahead.
no, that's the irony of it. I mean, that's when after listening to Sol, who himself was a Marxist, and when this issue came to a head, and he realized, well, the reason why there was these special interest groups who wanted a minimum wage is because they wanted a minimum wage
Right.
and not below that. But they didn't really give a rip about, let's say, these teenagers or folks who are coming into the early 20s who've never had a job and they've got to get some experience. They might be unskilled, or even if they've learned something, they just don't have any experience. I mean, a lot of university students are out there. They live in this illusion that, if I've got a degree now, somehow I'm so in demand. And like, well, no, that doesn't follow. In the real world, people want to know if there are other things about you. It might be just a basic requirement. But I think that I really appreciated Thomas Sowell's work on it, that ultimately and ironically, this actually harms the very people it's presupposing that it's going to help. And yeah, I just don't understand it as well. It's just always very difficult to get past some of these front intuitions that people have about exploitation, because I think that's the big idea here. It's the proverbial, the capitalist Scrooge out there oppressing people versus, I'm going to be the hero of my community and I'm going to stop that exploitation and I'm going to make sure you get some as well. And then what ends up happening ultimately is you just have another crowd of Scrooges on, government officials running the show. So instead of a guy in a suit who's exploiting people, you've got a bunch of government officials that basically are telling us all how to live, and we now have to live under the burden of all of their oppressive ideas and laws. And so that's the exchange here. I just got a whole bunch more questions.
As a last point, just on the minimum wage, just for those who
Yes.
might find themselves more inclined towards sort of how a socialist or a left worldview, if one is concerned about privilege, things like the minimum wage entrench political and corporate privilege. They protect big business from competition. So if you're concerned about that kind of thing in a robust way, you need to be against these sorts of policies that protect and entrench real privilege, not the various forms of privilege that flows around now, but actual economic power, political privilege. You need to identify those barriers and advocate against those that just protect the currently employed and protect them from competition. Big corporates have big divisions. They can deal with whatever regulations the government throw at them. Big business, small and medium businesses, they suffer and they die ultimately. So if you want an actual transformed and robust economy, you should advocate against those policies that just entrench current privilege.
Yeah. I've just got a friend of mine, Eric's walking around in the background, just asked me an important question then. I think philosophically, perhaps you could make an argument that even the admission of something like a minimum wage is a tacit admission that the free market actually exists, that there are certain needs and values, and that not everything is equal, So, for example, even though they want a minimum wage for people, you do realize that there's some level at which certain people do deserve to get a higher wage than others. Right. People with a tremendous, for example, somebody who's an eye surgeon. Now, eye surgeons earn a lot of money, but they have to go to medical school for nearly 15 years or something crazy like that. Once you've gone through all the processes and expertise and, training from a basic medicine degree. So it's a huge amount of investment. Of course, the return is big, but of course, there are rare kinds of people with a certain sets of skills. So really, if you want to implement this equality across all lines, you would just want to have everybody gets the same. Right. In society, everybody gets X for a salary, regardless. But that actually, in some sense, is unjust. And so the fact that you're actually introducing a minimum wage, in some sense, is a tacit admission that you're acknowledging that not everything is equal. And what we don't mean by that is that you as a person aren't equal. It's just that if you're coming straight out of high school and you've got no experience and you're unskilled, I can't suddenly get you working with dangerous machinery that is going to kill you if you're in your fabrication shop or something. and the guy who spent 5 years honing his skill on a metal lathe deserves more because he spent 2 years or 3 years or whatever learning how to machine, crankshafts or whatever it is. I mean, the intuitions of the socialist programs are actually, they look like they're going to liberate people, but they're fundamentally unjust in many respects. And I think people understand that. I don't know, what would you say to that?
Yeah, all I'd add to that, and I agree with you completely. I'd add the different conceptions of equality and inequality. So
Yeah.
one needs to understand equality before the law, yes, that's across the board. And again, it's with the advent of democratic rule of law based systems and countries around the world, which started with the quote unquote evil West in England and America. That's where these ideas first flourished with the Enlightenment, the idea that people are equal in the eyes of the law. That's different from equality of outcome in terms of economics, where everyone should have the same, depending on not even depending on the work they do, but just by virtue of being alive, sort of thing. That's the idea you have with the universal basic income. So also unpack just what people mean by equality, or I mean, maybe I'm giving people this tool to use against me, but whenever you engage with people on these ideas, always ask why and by what standard. How do you define this? Why do you define equality or inequality as this way? Just keep on pressing. And I mean, here and there, you might quote unquote be cancelled. Someone might say, oh, that's an aggressive question. How can you ask that? But if they want to, ultimately, the burden of proof rests on those people who want to limit your liberty. So keep asking them why, by what standard.
Okay, good. You said, yeah, there's another question here that's coming from our YouTube channel. There is a mention of basic rights that people have. What are these? What are the foundation of these rights, and where did they come from? You just touched on that briefly in your previous response, and maybe you can unpack that for us.
Yeah, so for us in general, it's people are going to live together in society. We're going to have societies no matter what. So, what framework is best for that? And the best framework we consider to be for that is a robust conception of individual rights, your freedom to your property, your person, your speech, your thinking, those sorts of things. Because by being free in those things and having the right to those things and being protected, you have a sort of circle around you where no one else can interfere onto. Of course, if you violate the rights of others, then the state should intervene accordingly. You can also have what, and I'm no theologian, but one has the theological argument for individual rights where because God created people as individuals, they should have individual rights, and he created people with free will. He wouldn't want you to think or act in a way that you are compelled to do, but you've come to those decisions on your own. You might make mistakes in that way, but for your freedom, for your free will to actually mean something, you need to use it, you need to make mistakes, and sometimes you're going to come to the wrong conclusion. So one has that argument, that element of individual rights and freedom as well. I think it's also just important to keep in mind the difference between negative and positive rights. So a negative right, in my conception, is, for example, my freedom of action, and where my rights stop. Again, that circle idea. My right to, I don't know, like running a business does not extend to me owning someone as a slave. That violates his right to life and his very free will, kind of thing. Just because I have a right to business doesn't mean I can violate the rights of other people and I should be treated accordingly. Then that runs against the idea of positive rights, again, where it's an obligation on the state or someone else to provide you with a service. So the right to healthcare, for example. If one says you have the right to healthcare or right to a house, you implicitly then accept that either the state or someone else should force that hospital to give you that service, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. So that's a big debate then over how we frame what we mean by rights and how broadly we span that, because if you expand it outwards, then it does put a demand upon others to do that then. So how would you do then? What advice could you give to people? Because of course in South Africa and in Africa, there's a continent is overwhelmed with varieties of needs. We see, South Africa is often there's famous aerial photographs in Time magazine of the disparity between, your wealthy suburb areas, gated communities, and across the motorway, you have a picture of a shanty town with people living under, corrugated sheets of iron built with mud and poles, How do we as citizens deal with this self-evident issue that confronts all of us every single day in South Africa? I mean, what is the way out of that now? I mean, everybody, whether they're religious or not, is aware of that. Whether they're secular, whatever your convictions are, that's just the obvious thing in South Africa. But how can we get out of it? Because it seems at the moment the government is saying, well, we have a way out. We'll redistribute everything, and we'll implement all of these policies and procedures, and we'll continue to control all these other massive state-owned enterprises. And that's how we're going to get out of this hole. How do we as citizens move forward on that? What ideas do you have to share with us there?
Yeah,
Like
so
responsibility towards your neighbor who you know is suffering. Like, I mean, what do we do there? What do we do with that?
I think private citizens and private charities are a lot more efficient and less. There's a less chance for not that it won't happen, but there's less chance for corruption when people engage with each other in their communities and their charities and through their churches, their synagogues, their mosques, in caring for their fellow human being. They should have the
Okay.
freedom to do that. And I think the only you're not going to be able to help people around you. No one is going to be able to do that without first having some sort of resource or wealth creation idea. You can't help people, if you have
You've
nothing
got
to sort of
nothing to
give
say.
them or help them with, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And this goes to the idea of redistribution versus creation. So we can redistribute. Let's say that let's say that wealth is fixed. I think that the bigger the government grows, wealth does become fixed because the only people who can decide where it goes is the political class. So the more wealth is fixed, the sooner you're going to run out of the amount being redistributed. We can go in this direction, but we're going to run out of it eventually. At the moment, we don't ask how do we create wealth, and not even how do we create it and give it to others, because again, that's assuming that you or I as individuals are the ultimate saviors of other people. We don't ask what's best for them, like what ingredients are needed for them to help themselves and create wealth for themselves. So if you see people in shanty towns and poorer areas, try and figure out what legislation and policies are inhibiting the growth of that area. Is it a vestige from apartheid? Is it a vestige from the Group Areas Act? Is it a vestige from people not being allowed to start businesses by virtue of the color of their skin, and eliminating those vestiges and what still remains? For example, Black South Africans for centuries were denied their property rights. After 94, we had a good land reform program going. Now we're heading again towards expropriation without compensation. We're not giving people title deeds. We're not giving them the actual ownership to their home and that they can use as capital and collateral. There where property rights are stronger, on average, people have better quality of life. And unfortunately, African governments, after independence from Western powers, they've largely dabbled in socialist and government-centric ideas. I would recommend going to read George Ayite. He's, I think, a Ghanaian academic economist. He does a lot of stuff on the destructive effects of statist ideology and policies on Africa. Africa has untapped, unlimited potential. Nowadays, people talk about sort of China taking over from the US and the role that the US has played in the world. People forget about the potential of Africa because we don't have the right policies and ideas in place. At the moment, it's just governments trying to sort of keep their little fiefdoms and their little powers, as it were, and controlling people's lives. So there's a lot of potential in Africa, but Africa needs to try economic freedom, I think, properly. Africa has never tried economic freedom to a great extent. Before colonialism, you had strong trade empires centered in places like Timbuktu, for example. And then the colonial empires decided to divide up Africa according to arbitrary borders, and we still have the unfortunate legacy thereof. You're not going to do that legacy by just redistributing wealth and just forcing productive people to leave the continent. You're going to alleviate that legacy by giving African people the economic freedom to actually create wealth for themselves, to trade with each other, to trade with the world, and to invest in their societies. And I think it's a much more dignified view to consider people agents and consider that they have free will then you think the only way they can get ahead is by waiting for a check from government at the end of the month, and that somehow that's magically going to solve things. That's, of course, not to say that with South Africa's legacy, you can't have a form of social welfare, but I think it needs to be limited and means tested up to a point. It can't just be this indefinite thing. You need to encourage some sort of like dynamism and activity and stuff like that. Say that the welfare grant must be invested in something, or spent on this thing or that thing. And then you need the government to be transparent in that. So we need to have a lot higher standards on our government. And you can't just expect the thing to continue indefinitely. I don't think that's the right way of viewing our fellow human beings, as it were.
Yeah. So let's get back to this now, because as you've unpacked some of those considerations for solving the overwhelming needs here in South Africa, which we're all very aware of, how do we help our neighbors? It might be the conclusion of these African governments is saying, well, look, if we just persist with these state communist policies, okay, then maybe it will turn out like China. I mean, we might even do better than China, because China has to come to Africa to get most of its resources. We're standing on the resources, but look at the success of China. Look at the Olympics. Look at the monorail system. Look at the massive cities and skyscrapers and infrastructure they're putting in now. Yeah, you've got a country with the second largest economy in the world that is overtly communist. They're not even socialist, they're communist. It's the Chinese Communist Party. And look at the raging success. I mean, before long, who knows, they maybe might even overtake the economy of the United States of America. So what would you say to people who are saying to him, well, you just need to be patient, Chris. We've just got to wait for these policies to kick in, and before you know it, we're going to end up like China. How about that for an objection? What would you say to that?
Well, why wait until an undefined point when you can have some measure of improvement now if you actually implement some economic freedom? A more meta point, I think is important to point out here is just what do we by what do we measure the importance of a particular ideology or economic system? Is it only by quality of life or actual moral standards? And to me,
Okay.
the moral is more important. So yes, China might deliver X, Y, Z in terms of goodies, in terms of factories, in terms of whatever. But is that a right and just and moral way for people to live, just being dependent on the state and the state's bureaucrats dictating where things should be invested? It might deliver, some better outcomes. It might be more pragmatic, as it were, but I don't consider it to be more moral necessarily. I don't think any system that's premised on force can be considered moral, unfortunately. I think China is a fascinating example. The Chinese people, I think, have shown what they can do through eons of oppression and devastation. Mao Zedong, I mean, he might be on depending on how grim one wants to get, he could probably be the most brutal dictator that the world has ever seen in terms of the number of people that his policies resulted in the death of, never mind Hitler and Stalin. Interesting that all of them share a statist ideology. Never mind if they were fascist or communist, but they all share the view that the state should be controlling and guiding people's lives for whatever end it might be. But that's another matter for another day. China tried the hard communist route through Mao, and then it had reforms for many years with actual economic dynamism and activity. And now we see another crackdown by President Xi Jinping on companies like the one owned by Jack Ma, his company Alibaba, because the communist state is getting worried about how well Chinese companies are doing and how well they're responding to market needs. And of course, a company can't interfere on the role that the state should be playing, at least from the communist worldview. So we're going to see a crackdown, unfortunately. I think that'll be to China's ultimate detriment. China is heading into problem. I know in the last week they've announced they're now allowing people to have, I think, 3 children. So, I mean, how nice of the state to allow you to have as many children as it were. But that's when you run into the problem when the state should provide for all your healthcare. Then they're going to make those sorts of demands on you. They're going to tell you you can't smoke or you can't drink because you're going to be a burden on the state if you have too many children, for example. So they have problems where they have an aging population. They rely a lot on investment from the West. So I know that the West trades a lot with China and is dependent on the market for it. But China is also dependent on the West for a lot of things. And they're going to run into these problems slowly but surely. So, yeah, To go back to the meta point, just because the system delivers X, Y, and Z goodies doesn't mean it's moral. Just always ask that question, and also actually consider how you want people to live.
Yes, and I think if my memory serves me correct, I believe that one of the policies under Mao was to take obviously property and title away from people.
Hmm.
And in the case of the agrarian economy that was China during the Chinese Revolution, he did precisely that. And of course, then these guys were put on communes, and good farmers who were good at doing farming were then told to go and
Yep.
make steel, and that was a proverbial disaster. And then they starved to death to the tune of 30 million people, in what was ironically called the Great Leap Forward. There's never been a more ironic concept. It was the greatest leap backward ever in the history of mankind. I mean, it's unbelievable. I've just been reading on this recently. But as I understand it, is when the reforms that come, what they kind of did was default to a free market kind of idea and concept, was just give the farmers back their farms and say, look, please go back and do what you're good at. You know what I mean? And which is not a classic communist Marxist idea of getting rid of property and title. I mean, so it's kind of working counterproductive to those very ideals. Is that true? Is there any merit to that?
No, I think very much so. I mean, despite the best intentions of any central planner, they run into the realities of the world and of the market trying to function. We saw this last year in South Africa with the lockdown when the government tried to ban alcohol and cigarettes. People found a way. In the US, under prohibition, they tried to ban alcohol and people found a way. And often you just lead to worse outcomes then because you drive people to the black market and they try and sort of find other ways to get the products. We might see the same thing now with the firearm control amendment bill. You're going to then increase the amount of illegal guns around, and it's going to be more difficult to monitor. So I agree very much with your point. The central planners often have the best sort of ideas. I would recommend people go and read Friedrich Hayek on this point
Okay.
and the sort of folly of the central planner thinking that they have all the knowledge to decide on behalf of 60 million people how they should live day to day. I mean, maybe I'm not the best example, but some days I'm paralyzed by choice because I don't know what choices I'm going to make every day. I don't even know what I'm going to eat for lunch. But for a bureaucrat to think he's going to make these decisions for me, I think is the biggest form of hubris one can find.
Okay, that's good. Well, look, Chris, I tell you what, there's so much to discuss right now, and certainly our country is as you argued in your PowerPoint, there is slipping badly with our junk status in our economy, dropping in terms of freedom levels over the decades, and of course an increasing policing of society with government bureaucrats telling everybody what they should do and how we should live. And so I do think that we need to weigh these things, and then as individual citizens, think of how it is that we can, as South Africans, can build our communities. And it's probably going to happen between individual South Africans talking to their neighbor over the fence and saying, hey, what's going on here? Can I help out? How can I help out now? And
Yeah.
everything we can do to allow those actions and interactions to happen without the interference of government bureaucrats, I think is how, if there's to be a chance of us crawling out of this hole, that it's definitely going to be found there. I'm doubtful about this, suddenly Africa becoming China. I don't think that's going to happen here. I think it will fall apart much like Zimbabwe and Venezuela and follow the typical model of all of these other communist countries, which is to fall apart at the seams, and socialist countries. All right, Chris. Well, look, we've kind of out of time now because I know I had set aside an hour, just over an hour. But thank you so much for the long Q&A with you. And we should like to hear from you and more of the Free Market Foundation team in the future, and dealing specifically with all kinds of other issues. I'd love to hear you on your opinion of the state-owned enterprises here in South Africa and what must be done with those, to issues of advice for people starting businesses, policies. You spoke about your background in business ethics. How do we integrate this thinking into business ethics, freedom and these kinds of things? What to do with the current push towards social justice thinking, and that's now also becoming part and policy of the red tape now, with companies having to do diversity and equity training. And of course, what do you mean by the words diversity? What do you mean by equity? would like to ask you on that. I'd also love for you to unpack some of the history. I think the FMF's rich history is interesting. I think a lot of South Africans don't realize that really prior to our current administration, the apartheid government was a socialist government. In fact, the fact that the state-owned enterprises exist is a monument to the fact that our problem was socialist during apartheid, and it continues to be the case to this day, that it's still the same problem. So yeah, that would be interesting to hear you guys on the history of that as well. So there's many other issues we want to consult with you guys on and have back and forth with you and discussions. So we'll be in touch. But thanks very much for your time, and I trust that you have an excellent weekend. And if you are going to be heading up to Ghana to go and do some talk that I think you may be doing, I hope that it goes well with you up there. And once again, thank you for your time.
No, thank you, Simon. Always a great pleasure to talk to you guys. Thank you very much for the platform and engaging with us. Always a great privilege. We hope to engage with you a lot more with the students. Please send us any ideas and feedback that you might have. An argument, I think a good idea that one should keep in mind is your ideas are only as good and as sort of robust as you can engage with them and defend them and like question them yourself. So let's have that back and forth. Let's have that discussion. I look forward to that a lot. So thank you very much.
Okay, take care. Have a good weekend, Chris.
Thank you. Bye.